Well, my mother and daddy were members, and since about 1928. So when Daddy was getting older, I started asking him questions and trying to put down what he remembered, and then I would go home and write it down. And then later, Jim Middleton was a fill-in for the church administrator. And he called me and asked me to come down and look at all the pictures that they had here and see if I could help. So I came down and found them, and I said, if you let me take them home and look through all of this, I'll be glad to do it. And so I kept them for 2 years. And little by little, I wrote down the history of the church as I could find it. So that's how I got into it. Well, after a couple of years, in 1825, there were 750 people in Macon. And so about 4 different congregations started meeting, and they all met at the little wooden courthouse. That was the only building. And the Presbyterians had 25 that would gather once a month. And we had a man from Savannah, Reverend Joseph Clay Stiles, and he would come up on horseback and he would preach to the Presbyterians, and that's how we got started. And then in about 1826, they wanted to get incorporated and to form a church. And so Reverend Stiles came, and that was done. We formed the Presbyterian Church in Macon with 25 members. He was an architect, and he designed the first church that we built, which was opened in 1829. It was down on the lower end of Poplar Street, and it was made out of white wood. And the interesting thing about that church is it's still in Macon today. The history of it was when we moved into our second church, Elam Alexander bought this first church, and eventually the Catholics that were forming in Macon bought it from him, and they worshiped there until we moved into our present church. And then they bought our second church. Well, they wanted to sell it, and the only way they could sell it was to write to the Pope and get permission. And he wrote back and said, you can sell it if you take it down off of the land and move it. And so it was moved, and it's now over behind the Law Enforcement Center, and it's been the Fulton Baptist Church for over 100 years. Then we built, Elam Alexander helped build the second church, which we opened in 1837, and it was just a little brick church down close to where the Boodle building is now. We only have one thing left from that, and that's a picture of it. It was red brick. And we stayed there for 20 years. And then we had an elder in the church that owned the property that we own now. And it was in the city limits of Macon. Anything across the street, like Mulberry Church, was outside the city limits. And that was John Gresham. And he offered the land to the church, and they bought it and paid him $3,000 for it. And they got plans for the building and started building, and it was opened in 1858. And they spent $25,000 building the building. And it is the sanctuary like we know today, the same footprint that we had then, and it had a big room underneath, which they used for Sunday school. Well, one interesting thing that's the same, which I don't think people really look for, is there's on the outside, on the First Street side, there's a moat. And if you look, you can see an open space there, and they did that so that the light could reach windows underneath. Now, the way the land slopes, you don't have to do that on the other side. But that moat is still here today as it was built. The pews are the same. And they have numbers on them, and that's one question that everybody wants to know, why they were numbered. And the interesting thing is that they were rented, and as a family you would rent, and that's where you were expected to sit. And I found some things in the newspaper, little ads that said, one of them says, "Notice the slips." That's what they call the pews. In the Presbyterian church will be rented on next Saturday at 10 o'clock, at which time the bell will be rung to give notice. And then another one in 1877, and the sessional records showed this. It said, "On motion it was resolved that notice be given that the pews of the church will be rented for the current year on Monday next, between the hours of 11 and 12 o'clock. And then a few years ago, just by accident, somebody downtown that was tearing down an old building found a pew receipt and gave it to one of our members, and so we have that now, and it's dated October the 31st, 1880, and it was a receipt for $25 for 6 months, and this was for pew number 12. But then I found in the church records that in 1906, the yearbook says, "Pews are free, but it is best that the members should occupy the same pews regularly, and as far as practically all worship in family pews." So they did away with the renting. Lots of things are different now. The windows were plain glass, and they had shutters on the outside and shutters on the inside. When you think about the sun coming in through clear glass, I'm sure that was probably a problem. They had frescoes on the wall, but we have never been able to, when we changed the plaster, they could not save enough to see what the frescoes were about. We had gas lights on the side. They had a clock up in the steeple that had it had 4 faces on it, and it was the main clock for the city of Macon for a long time. It also had a bell inside. There was no choir loft in the first church. There was the steps on the front, of course. The steps in the front of the sanctuary were little curved steps that went down underneath, and that's how you got from the big room underneath into the sanctuary, was these little curved steps. Now they've been all taken out, except the ones that go to the balcony, and they are original. They still have those little curved steps. The room itself is the same size, and of course the pews have been changed around, and the balcony has certainly been renovated several times. At first, it was not elevated, so if you sat up there, you really couldn't see anything. And the first organ that we had was in the balcony, and then they moved it to the front of the church, behind the pulpit. That was done in about 1893, when they did a renovation then, and they added the dormer windows up in the ceiling. They had a low-hung ceiling initially, and they took that off and went into the ceiling and put the dormer windows with a little stained glass in it, which I'm sure opened up the church a lot. And then in 1908, they had a major renovation, and that's when the windows, as we know them today, were put in, all except for 2. One of them is the 23rd Psalm that's dedicated to Mrs. Curd, and she died in like 1920, so we know that that window was put in later. And then the window that is so different was put in 1966, and that was given in memory of Mr. and Mrs. Rad Turner by their family. They took the old window out, crated it up, and put it down in the furnace room, and it has been there all this time. But this year we got to use it, and when we remodeled the chapel, and it is now in use, the old window. I think it's interesting that a congregation of 200 in 1856 would consider building a building the size that we have. Of course, we've added on to it, but the sanctuary is the same size, and I think that's just amazing that they did that. They had the foresight to do that and to put the big room underneath, and that's all they used. Even when I was small, that room underneath was used for all the meetings that we had, for serving lunches and dinners, and on Sunday night they had Vespers, and that's where we would meet for Vespers. So I think it's just amazing that they had the foresight to do that. Well, we went and worshiped at the Grand Theater, the ones that I can remember, and I think they even did that in 1908, which is wonderful. That it's just right across the street. And so we have used that several times through the different renovations, and very convenient. People made pledges for it in 1924, but then the Depression came and they couldn't pay off what they had pledged, and they had a terrible time through the 30s, trying to get out of debt. And then in 1941, they had paid off, and my daddy remembered they had a little fire out in front of the building and burned up all the paperwork from the debt for that building. The Depression was so bad, he took a cut in pay because he knew how hard the times were. He had been a chaplain in World War I, and so when World War II came and they used Camp Wheeler again, he was used a lot at Camp Wheeler to try to influence the soldiers to come and find a church home. And he encouraged them to come to our church and other churches, and I think Macon really reached out to the soldiers. A lot of them were from New England and Pennsylvania, and they just had no family here at all. The members took them home for lunch after church, and then they came back for this Vespers on Sunday night, and we had a lady named Mrs. Ruth Millirons, and she could play anything on the piano. And she would sit down and they would stand around the piano and sing and just have such a great time. We also had a lot of weddings from the soldiers. They met girls in Macon, and we built a little chapel in that room that was underneath. It had no windows, and it would seat maybe 50 people, I guess. But that was, I think we even had the wedding in there the same day that it was finished. But it was used for a lot of the weddings for the soldiers. Well, right after the war, we got permission to build a little flat building that had about 2 rooms in it, and it was behind the Sunday school building. And we used that for the nursery, and then we had some classrooms in there. And next to it was a parking lot. We had not had a parking lot, and so one of the members' houses had been torn down for I-75, and they gave us the proceeds, and that was what we did with the money. And then the next building that we really went into was in 1958, and that was called We Build Today for a Glorious Future. And that's when we really expanded. We cut the doors in the front of the church that led into a fellowship hall. We added an elevator. We had the fellowship hall, which is now called the Gathering Place, on the first floor, and then upstairs were classrooms. We also built a chapel, and this was all completed in 1962. It cost $300,000, and we raised it in 2 weeks, so I think that's amazing. And then in 1968, we had to take the steeple down, We had found that it was just rotted. It's just amazing it was still standing. And they thought they could go in and just sort of repair it, but then they found out that they had to rebuild it to the same specifications of the original, but they made it in two pieces. So when they put it back up, it was easier to go as two than just the one piece. Then in 1969, we had the Emmanuel Fund that came up, and we raised money there for four things. One was Dr. Richards wanted a school, and he wanted it down at the church. And part of the money was to go to that. And then we wanted money to help restore the Sunday school building. It needed a fire escape and other things. We also raised money for recreation area for our members. We were going to try to have a swimming pool. And then the fourth point was to have money on hand when any property came up, so that we could buy anything that came up for sale, because we're landlocked and we needed that money on hand. So that's what we did then. And of course we started the school and decided we needed to go to planning and zoning and get it approved, and they said you can't have a school downtown on Mulberry Street. So Mr. Peake withdrew his pledge and gave us land instead, and that's how the school ended up out on Foster Road. We opened in 1970 with 205 students and faculty of 9. And of course it's amazing today to see how it has grown. Then in 1982, we had the renovation of the sanctuary, and that's what these pictures here display. And we were out of there for 5 months while they went in and took all the pews out and took the plaster off the walls to waterproof the walls, and then they cleaned the windows and put Lexane on the outside to protect them. And then in 1984, which was just 2 years later, one of our new ministers came up with the idea that we needed a long-range plan for what we really wanted to. We were just sort of doing things as they came up. But he said, let's sit down and see what we really need. And the first thing on the list was we needed a nursery for the little babies, because what we had was not adequate at all. So we raised money, and that was called Continuing the Vision. And it was for a fellowship hall, and then underneath we have a nursery and a kitchen, commercial kitchen, and that was put up as the first phase of that. And then the second phase was to add more classrooms. So we got the Hayes building, plumbing building across the alley, and put in classrooms over there, and got approval to build a walkway over the alley. And so that was phase 2. Then in 1990, we added what I call wings onto the choir loft, because the choir director said it wasn't big enough, and so the little choir loft that had been built in 1924 was expanded, and the stairway going into it was enclosed, and so it changed quite a bit. Then in 2004, we renovated again the sanctuary, and this time we took up the carpeting that was down and found a hardwood floor. And so they stained it and had a rug made for the church that goes down the center aisle. And then we had to come up with the organ that we had that Miss Dolly Lamar had given us could not be repaired, and we had to have a new organ. And we could not find one that would fit in the space that we had in the choir loft, and so we had to take out all of the old choir loft and build what we have now, the new wooden pipes and everything that was made in Canada and brought down here and then assembled. And it changed the looks quite a bit, but we have a beautiful organ now. Oh. Then the latest thing we've done is the chapel renovation, which was done this year. And we went in and took down the chandeliers and had two made in Philadelphia for us. We took the window that I told you about and we had it refitted to fit in the front of the chapel, and that was done up by a man in Forsyth. And we added new cushions and of course paint, and now it's just lovely. And it's, oh, we had to get a new organ too for it, and we got an acoustical, I guess that's what you call it, organ that can sound like an organ or a piano. And we have that, and so it's all ready for weddings or for other use now. Well, the interesting part, the way the history came, the first one was done in 1858. That's when we moved into the main sanctuary and it was dedicated, and the minister then was a Reverend Brick. And he gave 32-year history of since the beginning of the church, and that was published in the Telegraph. And so that's the first history we had. And then in 1908, Mr. Robert Lanier Anderson did a history that brought us up to then. He also, in 1924, he brought it up to date, and the last time was a year before he died in 1958. So if we hadn't had those two men, we would know very little about the history of the church.